1951.
On July 2nd, we are in St. Petersburg, Florida. But before we begin, it is worth placing things in a bit of historical context to understand where we are, as this was a turbulent year worldwide. During this time, the European coal and steel community was founded. The trial of the Rosenberg couple began, and the Hungarian People's Army was established. The Korean War was in full swing. The animated film Alice in Wonderland was released, and the Marshall Plan also came to an end that year. Meanwhile, the United States was experiencing an unprecedented level of economic growth. Just to help imagine America at the time, the timeless classic The Godfather Part 2, specifically Michael Corleone's storyline, takes place in the 1950s. At the location of our events in St. Petersburg at 1200 Cherry Street on the Alamanda apartment row, a small apartment was rented by a 67-year-old widow named Mary Reeser. She had moved to the state a few years earlier after her husband's death from Columbia, Pennsylvania, to be closer to her son and grandchildren. According to accounts, she loved her family very much and was an especially entertaining woman, though she had difficulty tolerating the warmer climate and also missed her friends back in Pennsylvania. On July 1st, a Sunday, she was visited by her son, the younger Dr. Richard Reeser, who later recalled that his mother was somewhat irritated by the hot weather. Because of this, she wanted to travel back north to Pennsylvania for the summer, but up to that day, she had not been able to arrange it, and this also upset her. At around 9 p.m., Dr. Richard decided to leave and said goodbye to his mother with a kiss. During their farewell, Mary Reeser mentioned that she had not had dinner and that before going to bed she would smoke a cigarette in her upholstered armchair. She also added that she had already taken 2 sleeping pills called Seconal and that she might take 2 more before going to sleep. Because of the heat, she left the apartment windows open and from that point on spent the night alone. The next day, July 2nd, the weather in the coastal city remained pleasant, warm and summery, with daytime highs close to 34 degrees Celsius, dropping only to about 24 degrees at night. At around 8 a.m., while it was still slightly cloudy, the neighboring landlady, a certain Pansy Carpenter, knocked on the widow's door to deliver a telegram message that had been brought to her earlier by employees of Western Union. Upon reaching the single-story residence, she noticed that the door was warm and the doorknob was hot, something that usually occurs when a fire has broken out. When she opened the door, she saw that near the entrance, among the soot-covered walls, embers were still crackling in one spot. She quickly called the police and the fire department, who found the charred remains of Mary Reeser among the debris, while almost nothing remained of the armchair except its metal springs. What was left of the widow was mostly just ash. But here is the striking part. The lower portion of her left leg below the knee remained intact, still wearing a black satin house slipper. In addition, part of her spine was found, in much worse condition, as well as her skull, which had shrunk. According to reports, it had shrunk to about the size of a teacup. Tooth-like remains were also found, but even at the time there was uncertainty about this, when they were forwarded to the FBI. However, the oddities did not end there, because the room had not completely burned out, only the area immediately surrounding the armchair in which the woman had been sitting. The plastic electrical switches on the upper part of the room had melted, but were not destroyed, above the level where the soot marks began. The wooden furniture suffered little damage, and the walls also escaped relatively lightly in terms of burning. Of the candles in the room, only the wicks remained, with the wax melted and spread beneath them. The lower parts of the apartment's walls remained almost intact, as did the electrical outlets there, and Mary Reeser's bedding also remained white, while the newspapers stacked near the armchair were untouched, as if nothing had happened. On a table in the room, investigators found an electric clock that had stopped at 4:20, presumably in the early hours of the tragedy, since it worked perfectly when plugged in elsewhere. It appears that the fire may have ignited very suddenly and with tremendous intensity, but how long it lasted is only a matter of speculation, as the body could have burned for hours. In crematoriums, temperatures between 1000 and 1500 degrees Celsius are created, and the process can take 3 to 4 hours. The local police chief, J.R. Eichert, stated that in his 25 years of service, this was the strangest case he had ever encountered. Naturally, the tragedy appeared in the newspapers, after which they received hundreds of letters containing various tips from self-appointed investigators.
Some suspected lightning. Others went further and suspected napalm, phosphorus, or even thermite-based incendiary devices. There were even those who firmly claimed they had seen a fireball fly in through one of the open windows. Lacking a solution, the police chief turned to the FBI, and, in a letter personally addressed to J. Edgar Hoover, he wrote, "This fire is causing too much of a headache for such a small-town authority." Eichart and his colleagues sent boxes filled with evidence to Washington, including the previously mentioned tooth-like bone fragments, a smoke sample taken from the wall, the minimal amount of wood remaining from the chair, part of the carpet, as well as debris from both the wall and the floor. Experts from the Federal Bureau of Investigation spent 3 weeks conducting examinations, and on August 8th, Chief Eichart announced in a press release that the FBI had found no signs of a lightning strike, for example, because the fuses and wiring remained intact. They also found no substances that could have been responsible for the fire, such as alcohol or any kind of fuel commonly found in households, and they detected no characteristic odors either. Alongside dismissing earlier frivolous tips, they also ruled out the possibility of so-called spontaneous human combustion. It is worth mentioning that it is not without precedent in history for people to catch fire in an unexplained manner. In one case, an 89-year-old woman named Margaret Hogan died in a similar way in Dublin, Ireland. In that room, too, damage occurred, only near the fire, and only the parts of her legs below the knees remained. The official investigation was unable to determine the cause of the fire. A 73-year-old man named Henry Thomas experienced almost the same fate. The retired man from South Wales burned to death in his apartment. In his case, only the skull and the part of his leg below the knee remained. The basic claim of spontaneous human combustion, or burning, would be that no external ignition source plays a role in the development of the fire, and that the flames originate within the human body, which is not exactly a scientific approach. In every case, some kind of chemical chain reaction must develop, but according to the evidence, this cannot always be identified. The appearance of the term spontaneous human combustion itself can be traced back to the first half of the 18th century, when a scholar named Paul Rowley wrote about the mysterious death of Countess Cornelia Zangari Bondi, the grandmother of the future Pope Pius VI. Rowley translated into English a work from 1731 by a Veronese historian named Giuseppe Bianchini. In it, Bianchini writes that the 62-year-old countess appeared exhausted during dinner on a Thursday due to joint pain. The woman, who was known to consume large amounts of brandy, applied a kind of alcoholic camphor-based liquid made from brandy to the painful areas to relieve them, and continued doing so even after withdrawing to her quarters. There she spoke and prayed with her maid for about 3 hours, and then fell asleep. The next morning, the same servant noticed that the Countess did not wake up at the usual time, so she went to her room but received no response to her calls. She eventually entered and found only the ash remains of Countess Bandy about 120 centimeters from the bed. Only her 2 legs below the knees remained with the stockings still on, as well as part of her skull and 3 blackened fingers, while everything else was destroyed. smoke was still lingering in the room at the time of discovery. The walls were sooty, and only a small oil lamp was found in the ashes, which had run out of oil. Other parts of the room remained relatively intact, including the nearby bed, the candles, and the wooden furniture, which was only blackened. The solution is likely to be found somewhere between the alcoholic spray and the oil lamp, but there is no precise explanation for this death either. And although in our case it cannot be taken as 100% certain, the FBI theory is still very likely, which is also called the wick effect, and during which the victim's clothing absorbs their own body fat and then behaves like a wick. It is known that Mary Reeser smoked heavily and was somewhat overweight at 67 years old. Her weight was approximately 78 to 80 kilograms. The nightgown and house robe she was wearing that day were made of rayon acetate, which can ignite easily, even from the smoldering ash of a cigarette. Ultimately, the FBI gave the explanation that due to the sleeping pills, the woman likely fell asleep while smoking. Then the ember could have fallen onto her flammable clothing, which ignited, and what may have particularly intensified the fire was the fat that first melted and then soaked into the clothing. They also emphasized that although the armchair had been treated with fire-retardant materials, it was almost completely destroyed. The clothing theory is further supported by the fact that only the parts of her body not covered by the nightgown remained, namely the lower part of her legs. In addition, according to the investigation, the entire apartment did not burn down because there were no flammable objects in the immediate vicinity of the armchair, and there was a concrete floor underneath. It was also written that the heat released from the burning body tends to rise and form a layer of air that does not come into contact with the lower parts of the room. Human fat on its own is capable of fueling a fire for a long time, in addition to other combustible materials such as methane, which can also form in the human body. It is important to emphasize that although the human body is 70% water, and therefore is not considered flammable, this amount is not present in bottled form. Therefore, the FBI stated in its investigation, quote, "A Michigan forensic pathologist named Dr. Lemoyne Snyder also generally concluded that, in the case of obese people, fatty tissues are more flammable." However, the explanation did not account for the shrunken skull. An anthropologist named Wilton M. Krogman attempted to address this. After examining more than 30 fire-related deaths, he stated,
He also added that he doubted the reports of a shrunken skull because in his examinations the opposite occurred in every case. In his research, the skulls either exploded into hundreds of pieces or became abnormally swollen. It was also strange that no one in the neighborhood noticed the fire, not only afterward, but not even on the fatal night, not even Pansy Carpenter, who was her neighbor. Later, she told authorities that she smelled some smoke around 5 in the morning, which she attributed to the overheating of a water pump in the garage, so she turned it off and went back to sleep. There is therefore no clear explanation for what happened to Mary Reeser on July 2nd. It is especially sad that, as it turned out, the telegram message intended for the woman stated that everything had been arranged for the homesick Pennsylvania retiree's return trip, and that she would soon be able to leave.